Black girl rejected at train station. But one stranger made the whole town bow. You didn't say you were. The man's voice trailed off as he looked her up and down, eyes filled with a mixture of shock and embarrassment. Isla Thompson didn't flinch. She had heard that hesitation before, seen that particular kind of retreat. He meant to say black, but couldn't form the word, as if her presence was a betrayal of the image he had crafted in his mind. She stood tall on the train platform, clutching the small suitcase that held all she had left, her savings, her letters, her future, and a single hat she had bought for this occasion, now feeling like a joke on her head. 6 months of exchanged letters, promises, shared dreams, and not once had Gregory Callahan asked about the color of her skin. She had hoped, perhaps naively, that he wouldn't care, that a small-town farmer looking for a wife might see past what so many others couldn't. But as he took another step back, bouquet trembling in his grip, Isla knew exactly how this would end. The townspeople of Wellspring began to pause, curious eyes turning her way. A black woman, nicely dressed, well-spoken, standing beside a white man who was clearly rejecting her. The picture practically painted itself. "You wrote beautifully," he stammered. I just assumed." Isla cut him off, her voice calm but edged with something sharp. "You assumed I looked like you, that your image of love had no room for someone like me." He didn't respond. His silence screamed. "I used the last of my money to come here," she added, not pleading, just stating a fact. "I have no home to return to, no family waiting." Gregory reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a few wrinkled bills. "Maybe this will help you get somewhere else." Before Isla could reply, a voice behind them interrupted with effortless authority. "Is that how you handle your problems, Callahan? Toss money at them and hope they disappear?" The voice belonged to a man neither of them recognized at first glance. He wasn't loud, but the stillness that followed made him feel 10 feet tall. Dressed plainly but with unmistakable confidence, he moved toward them with the kind of calm that only people used to power carried naturally. Gregory turned, his face losing what color it had left. "Mr. Whitmore," he managed, "this isn't your concern." The man's gaze remained fixed on Isla. "Perhaps it is," he said. "Miss, are you being stranded here without a place to go?" She hesitated, unsure of what game this stranger was playing. "I suppose I am now." "Then allow me to offer you temporary shelter at my estate." "Yes, you? No obligation. Only dignity." Isla didn't answer right away. Her pride was bruised, her trust shaken, and the last thing she needed was to be beholden to another man. But something in his eyes told her this wasn't pity. It was something else. Recognition, perhaps. "My name is Grant Whitmore," he added. "I own Whitmore Fields, just east of town. I'm not in the habit of watching decent people get thrown away like they're nothing." Gregory's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His protest was swallowed by his own irrelevance. Isla finally nodded, not out of desperation, but choice. Not because she needed saving, but because this time she would choose the next chapter. Not a man's fantasy, her own reality. As she stepped into Grant's carriage, every head on that platform watched her go. They didn't know her name, not yet, but they would. The carriage ride to Whitmore Fields was silent except for the rhythmic clatter of wheels against the gravel path. Isla sat stiffly across from Grant, her hands clasped tightly on her lap, eyes watching the fields roll by. She hadn't thanked him. Not yet. Gratitude required trust, and she wasn't ready to give that to anyone. Not after what had just happened. When the carriage stopped, the house that stood before her wasn't the modest farmhouse she expected. It was something else, sprawling, old but well-kept, with a presence that suggested generations had passed through its halls. Grant didn't offer a grand introduction. He simply opened the door and said, "You're safe here." Mrs. Dalton, the housekeeper, greeted her with a polite nod. No questions, no raised eyebrows. Just a quiet, "We prepared the East Room. The bed is fresh." Isla didn't speak much that evening. Grant didn't press. Over dinner, he spoke only of practical things: weather, crops, shipments delayed due to rail strikes. He didn't ask about her journey. Didn't ask what had happened at the station. That, more than anything, made her pause. People usually wanted the story, the scandal. He didn't. The next morning, Isla wandered the house and discovered the library. It was larger than she expected, tucked behind heavy oak doors, the kind of room that felt forgotten but quietly alive. Dust lined the windowsills, but the books were well organized. Volumes of law, history, agriculture. She pulled one out. Wellspring County Land Records, 1842 to 1901. Her fingers hesitated at the spine. That night, as Grant passed her in the hallway, he nodded toward the book in her hands. Looking for something specific. She hesitated, just familiarizing myself with the area. He didn't question further. Later, in the quiet of her room, Isla unlocked the false bottom of her suitcase. Inside was a wrapped bundle of yellowed pages, brittle with age, deeds, letters, maps, all signed by the same name, Elijah Thompson, her great-grandfather. He had once owned land. A lot of it. She wasn't sure how much yet, but enough that it had been worth hiding. Her mother had given her the documents before she passed, along with a warning. This paper won't get you justice, but it'll get you to the truth. Then you'll have to decide what to do with it. Isla hadn't known what that meant until she opened that record book. The names matched. Not all, but enough. Parcel numbers, transfer dates, names of families who still lived in Wellspring, families who had become powerful. She spent hours in that library, reading, cross-referencing, not just land records, but local laws, loopholes, history books that revealed more in what they didn't say. Grant noticed. One afternoon, he leaned against the doorframe as she sat at the large table, papers spread out before her. "You're not just passing time," he said. "No, looking into something buried." "You could say that." He nodded once, slowly. "Let me know if you need help digging." Isla didn't reply, but for the first time since arriving in Wellspring, she felt something flicker inside her. Not fear, not anger, purpose. Isla didn't announce her discovery. She wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, she returned to the library each morning, sorting, reading, comparing every scrap of historical record she could find. She mapped old land deeds against current property lines, studied inconsistencies in signatures, dates, and boundary claims. And piece by piece, the puzzle came together. Elijah Thompson, her great-grandfather, had once owned nearly two-thirds of what was now considered Wellspring's historic district. Land that had been seized, not sold, after he disappeared from the record following a series of violent disputes with property committees formed by the town's original white settlers. Names she'd seen on the plaques downtown, donors, benefactors, church elders, repeated in the land transfer logs as recipients of parcels once marked under Elijah's name. The handwriting on the reassigned deeds was different. The dates suspiciously close together. The story was buried deep, but it was there. Isla photocopied every relevant page, took notes in her own coded shorthand, and cataloged everything into binders she kept locked in a chest beneath her bed. But gathering evidence wasn't enough. She needed to understand the town, the people, the rhythm of how things moved in Wellspring. So she stepped out of the library and into the community, not as a crusader, but as an educator. She asked Grant for permission to use the carriage barn on Sundays. He agreed without hesitation. By the second week, she had 7 children. By the fourth, nearly 20. Children of farmhands, domestic workers, young and shy, sitting on wooden benches learning how to read their own names. She taught them phonics, numbers, the power of a signature. Word spread slowly. Some people ignored her. Others whispered, but they watched. They noticed that the lady from the estate wasn't causing trouble. She was teaching kids. The kind of work no one else had bothered to do. One afternoon, as Isla packed up flashcards into a tin box, a woman approached her. Older, dressed in a faded coat, hands calloused from field work. "My grandson says you read stories to them. About people who used to live here." Isla smiled without smiling. "I tell them the truth." The woman nodded. "You keep telling it." Isla added her name to a growing mental list of people who saw more than they said. She kept teaching, kept gathering. She didn't confront anyone, not yet. But every week, as she uncovered more about the land her family once held, she also gained something far more important: the trust of a town that didn't know it was being studied. Every child who learned to write his name. Every mother who brought bread after class. Every elder who nodded without speaking. These were the threads Isla wove together while waiting for the right moment. Not revenge, not exposure, just clarity. And when the moment came, she would be ready with more than papers, with witnesses, with presence, with truth sharpened into fact. The town hall was packed. Rows of wooden chairs creaked under the weight of the founding families, landowners, and councilmen who had ruled Wellspring for generations without ever expecting to be questioned. Isla stood at the front, her file folder held tightly in one hand, her voice steady as she introduced herself not as a guest, not as a teacher, but as a direct descendant of Elijah Thompson, the rightful owner of over 60% of the land they now claimed as their legacy. The room shifted. Murmurs turned to scoffs. Councilman Draper leaned forward, smirking. "Miss Thompson, what exactly are you trying to prove? That your family once lived here? Oral stories don't hold up in legal matters." Isla opened the folder and laid out the first set of documents. Deeds signed by the state governor in 1870, maps marked with surveyor seals, pages too old to be easily dismissed. "These aren't stories," she said. "They're official land records, verified by the State Historical Archive and filed under Elijah Thompson, who vanished from Wellspring's public records 2 years after those deeds were transferred without sale or consent." Someone laughed. "That's impossible. Those lands have been in our families for a century." Isla didn't flinch. "That's the point. You believed that for a century because someone made sure the truth disappeared with him." Judge Alton cleared his throat. "We'll need to confirm authenticity." "Already done," said a voice from the back. Jeff Mahoney, a state-appointed attorney, stepped forward, briefcase in hand. "I've reviewed every document. They're real. And what's more, they're enforceable." Silence cracked like glass. Councilwoman Reese stood abruptly. "This is outrageous. You're accusing our ancestors of theft." "I'm not accusing anyone," Isla said. "I'm showing you what happened, and offering a chance to make it right." Grant Whitmore stepped beside her then, speaking for the first time. "If this town prides itself on values, then we face them now. We don't bury them deeper." More than half the room stared at him, stunned. His name meant power here. His voice carried weight. Draper pushed back his chair. "This will destroy everything. The town structure, the property lines, the lie already did that." Isla cut in. "This is the truth repairing it." Reverend Collier, one of the oldest men in the room, whispered something under his breath. Isla heard it. "My father warned me about this. Said there was blood under this land." The words hung there. Heavy. Real. No one moved. No one denied it. What started as a challenge became a reckoning. And every eye in that room now saw Isla not as an outsider, but as a mirror, not just of the town's past, but its accountability. When the legal window opened, Isla had the leverage to take everything. The land, the buildings, the properties built on soil that once belonged to her family. It was all within reach. Papers had been filed, titles verified, precedent supported. Even Jeff, the state attorney, quietly asked if she wanted to begin proceedings to reclaim ownership parcel by parcel. But she said no. Not because the claim wasn't valid, but because the legacy she carried wasn't built on erasing people. It was built on surviving them. She requested a different outcome. Before the council, in the presence of the same families that had once written her ancestors out of history, Isla proposed the creation of the Wellspring Future Foundation, a nonprofit funded by restitution, donations, and redirected town revenue, designed not to punish, but to uplift. Scholarships for underprivileged youth, affordable housing projects for displaced families, literacy programs, job training, medical access. A community center named after Elijah Thompson, built not as a monument to loss, but as a promise to rebuild with dignity. At first, there was resistance. The founding families didn't know how to react to mercy that came wrapped in power. Councilman Draper resigned quietly the following week. Reese stopped attending meetings, but others leaned in. Grant funded the first phase of the foundation with his own land proceeds. Reverend Collier offered church property as the site for the Learning Center. Mothers who once hesitated to speak now stood beside Isla during planning meetings. The town began to shift, not because of a courtroom verdict, but because of a vision stronger than vengeance. Children who once had no place to read now had shelves of books. Families who couldn't afford rent were being given clean homes. People saw change not as a threat, but as a future they wanted to be part of. And Isla, without ever raising her voice, without reclaiming a single acre, had rewritten the narrative of Wellspring, not by forcing them to remember what they'd stolen, but by showing them what it meant to give back. Gregory Callahan left Wellspring without ceremony. No goodbye, no letter, just a for sale sign hammered into the soil outside his farmhouse and a U-Haul parked overnight on the edge of town. The man who once stood on the train platform, bouquet in hand, now walked away with everything in boxes and nothing in his name. Pride had cost him more than reputation. It had cost him relevance. In the weeks that followed, no one mentioned his name. Not out of cruelty, but because no one needed to. His exit was already part of the story. Meanwhile, the center Isla founded was no longer just a foundation. It had become a living part of the town's fabric. She ran it with the same discipline she once brought to the classroom, but with something deeper now, authority earned. The classrooms inside bore the names of families from both sides of Wellspring's past, a quiet reminder that history can be rewritten when people decide to share the pen. She didn't need to prove herself anymore. The proof lived in the children who learned to read under her watch, in the mothers who dropped off donations instead of whispers, in the teenagers who asked her how to file paperwork for scholarships and voter registration. The town didn't just accept her, it followed her lead. And Grant? He was never the man who saved her. He was the man who believed her when no one else did. When they married, it wasn't a declaration of conquest. It was alignment. Two people who understood that legacy wasn't about what you inherited, but what you built for others. The land he once owned was now shared, converted into gardens, study halls, a vocational wing, and a public archive named after her great-grandfather. Every brick carried weight, every nail had purpose. The town that once watched Isla arrive in silence now stood with her in celebration. And as she walked the hallways of the center, checking classrooms, stopping to greet students by name, she knew she wasn't just correcting the past. She was shaping the future, and doing it without bitterness. Only resolve. The monument wasn't grand. Just a simple bronze plaque near the old town square, placed beside a bench where children now sat reading the very books Isla once taught from. It bore the name Elijah Thompson and a few lines etched in quiet defiance. He lost his land, but not his legacy. Justice delayed is not justice denied. People didn't gather to worship it. They passed by, paused, remembered. That was enough. Isla never asked for recognition, but recognition found her. Universities invited her to speak. Nonprofits asked for guidance. Journalists traveled to Wellspring wanting to understand how a woman once rejected on a train platform became the architect of a community reborn. She never told them what they expected. No speeches about pain, no dramatized revenge. Just the truth. That dignity is a decision. That building something better is harder than burning things down, but worth it. Wellspring changed. Not overnight, but deeply. The old guard faded without ceremony. New leaders emerged. Some young, some older, all chosen not by bloodline, but by merit. In classrooms, students no longer asked why the library was named after someone who had never been in their textbooks. They already knew, and in that knowing, the town kept growing. Grant often said the best thing he ever did was stay quiet when others spoke loudest. Isla called it listening. Together, they never made themselves the center of the story. They made room for others to become part of it. And if you ask anyone in Wellspring today who Isla Thompson was, they won't talk about courtrooms or property deeds. They'll say she taught them how to read, how to see, how to choose better. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that truth doesn't have to shout to change everything, then help us keep sharing stories that matter. Leave us a comment. What would you have done in Isla's place? Subscribe to our channel so we can continue telling real stories that remind us. Character will always matter more than color, and healing begins the moment someone chooses to rebuild instead of break.